Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. Due to scheduling issues, this episode is coming to you later than planned. My apologies for the delay. My guest this month is Brennan Kettelle. Brennan is a PhD researcher at the Center for History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, otherwise known as the HHP Center at the University of Amsterdam. Brennan holds an MA in Gender and Cultural Studies from 2016 and a research MA in Religious Studies, specializing in Western Esotericism from 2021. She is currently writing her doctoral dissertation investigating historical associations between the religiomythic demoness Lilith and queerness within artistic, literary, and occult discourses. Brennan also teaches an 8-week online course on Lilith, focusing on Lilith's origins and cultural receptions within Western esotericism for the Brooklyn-based organization Morbid Anatomy. Utilizing monster theory and queer theory in her research, Brennan is more broadly interested in investigating themes of the monstrous-queer within esoteric literature, orders, and figures, as well as esoteric themes within queer subcultures, politics, and histories. This episode is part 1 of 2. The second part is planned for December of this year. In this conversation, Brennan starts by explaining her motivations for delving into monster theory as part of her larger research into the figure of Lilith. Monster theory looks at what a group fears, as well as how marginalized populations or individuals align with the monstrous, what she's calling at this time stigmatized alignment. Monster theory is used here as the methodological axis upon which the larger research revolves. Brennan also talks about the background of this new area of study, its postmodern critical analysis of the monster, and how this has switched to looking at the monster from the monster's perspective, how the monster is used by people, and examining which groups become monstrous themselves. We talk a bit about this process in the figure of the vampire, as well as Lilith. Brennan also talks about how she is using the figure of Lilith as, quote, an esoteric example that shows the enduring historical entanglement between queerness and monstrosity, end quote. I hope you enjoy part 1. Welcome to the podcast, Brennan.
Thank you. It's so nice to be back.
It is great to have you back. For the longtime listeners of this platform, will remember you, of course, with your talks that you gave about Lilith and Renee Vivian, and you were talking about feminism and the subversive feminine and the empowered feminine, and then also about queerness as well. So you are really delving into this very interesting territory especially with Lilith. You're giving a course at the moment through Morbid Anatomy, so also about Lilith.
Yes.
And so you are doing a lot in that area, but you've also branched out into monster theory. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes.
And actually, we just decided before we started the recording that we're going to do 2 parts. This will be the first part. And we're going to shoot for December. You'll come back and we'll do a part 2 because you have a lot to say. And today we don't really have oodles and oceans of time. So we're going to have to divide it into 2 parts. But I'm very excited about that because that means I get to have you back and we'll get to talk more.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, there's never enough time to talk about monsters, really.
Right.
But I love talking to you about anything from, demons, the infernal, monsters, feminism, gender studies, queer studies, anything kind of niche, esoteric, monstrous. And it's far too sunny out right now, I think, for this to be our only monster discussion. So December feels when it's nice and cold and maybe dark really early. Yeah.
That would be perfect. Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we could start with your motivations for looking into this other area, or why you chose to put more focus on this right now for the time being anyway. You're going to be kind of really delving deep into all of this. So if you could start first about that, and then we can get into the background of monster studies, because this is also an interesting area to talk about too.
Yes. Yeah, I would love to, kind of start with talking about my motivation for, using monster studies and monster theory, within my own research. Essentially, I obviously got involved in monster studies or monster theory because my research is on the enduring religiomythic demoness Lilith. Looking at her in the 19th century, of course, and kind of looking for these discursive or semiotic associations between Lilith and queerness, mostly lesbianism, within 19th century art, literature, poetry, plays, socio-political discourses, etc. And I actually started this research in my research master's that I also did at the HHP. That was supervised by Peter Forshaw, who actually introduced me to monster studies. Just mentioned the term, and then I did a deep dive, and so I have to credit him for, planting that seed.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. And, I think that monster studies works well with what I'm doing, because if I were to synthesize it down into maybe one quippy sentence, it's kind of just, the concept of you can tell or we can tell a lot about an individual, a religious group, a culture, a society, a political party, what have you, by the monsters that they fear and employ. So when I was looking at Lilith within 20th century discourse, I kind of saw this, tension between discourses that would further vilify Lilith and kind of deploy her as a weapon to, spark and induce fear within different contexts. And then this, on the other side, these kind of marginalized or oppressed or outsider groups who would actually kind of take Lilith, reclaim Lilith, embrace the monstrosity of Lilith, and kind of use that for their cause, whether it was activism or their own inner strength and inspiration, whether they were a singular historical actor. And then I kind of witnessed that same tension still when I am researching Lilith within the 19th century discourse for my dissertation. Specifically, I mean that we can take, the pre-Raphaelites, for example, such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti's painting Lady Lilith and the accompanying poem that kind of frames Lilith as this murderous seductress who just seeks out men to strangle with her golden hair. And of course, you have Remy de Gourmand's play Lilith that really frames her as this kind of insatiable harlot, a concubine of God who got kicked away from God for being too sexually ravenous and went to be the partner of Satan. And it gets very kind of perverse and deviant and explicit. So again, it's kind of furthering this, deviancy and perversity within Lilith's monstrosity. But then you have this historical actor, Renée Vivien, who I have talked about with you before, the lesbian, self-proclaimed pagan poetess of the later 19th and early 20th century Parisian scene. She actually uses Lilith as a muse for her poetry, but also explicitly aligns Lilith with lesbianism. And so when I'm kind of seeing this tension, while I think monster studies and monster theory is so valuable, like it certainly drew me in with this whole concept of, if we look at what like a group fears and who, what monsters they are utilizing, we can tell actually a lot about that group. But I'm personally interested in what happens when marginalized individuals or marginalized populations actually align with the monstrous or reclaim the monstrous, something at the moment I'm calling stigmatized alignment in my dissertation research. We don't know if that name will stick, but
okay.
So we'll see.
It works.
It works. I like the stigmatized people, but also you have kind of a sexy stigmata nod, which I quite love.
Yeah.
Anyway. So that's actually my motivation in kind of playing with and using monster studies as kind of the methodological axis upon which my dissertation research revolves around, but almost the flip side of seeing, well, what happens when certain groups actually align themselves with the monstrous. So that's kind of what I'm playing with, and that's my motivation for engaging with monster studies and monster theory. But of course, the field is so much bigger than that, and way more useful even than just the way I'm using it. We can of course get into that more.
All right, well let's do that then. Let's talk about the background of the field, how it got started. It's a modern field, I would say, because you gave me some key texts, some influential texts, and the one that you have listed here, that is the earliest one, is from 1936, and that is Tolkien, Beowulf, the Monster, and its critics. But the other texts are quite modern. So I find that to be an interesting nugget of information as well, that this is coming out of this modernity. This is, well, what would this be considered a postmodern thing, or no?
Yeah, I think it would be considered a postmodern theory, and I'm saying that specifically because in the the Monster Theory Reader, which that one was compiled. Yeah. That one was compiled more recently within the 2020s, I believe.
You have here listed 1996.
No, that one was Monster Theory Reading Culture.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I think the Monster Theory Reader by edited by Weinstock. Oh yeah, that one was 2020. Yeah. So because this kind of huge collected volume that has so many of the articles of those who actually contributed to monster studies, or those who are now used in monster studies, kind of all contributed to this. And within this edited volume, there are essays by Julia Kristeva, who herself is, this kind of famous feminist psychoanalytic theorist. One of the chapters discusses Foucault and his kind of conception of monsters and monstrosity, and how they kind of align with or are perpetuated by various knowledge productions and mechanisms of control, or the desire of hegemonic control, etc. Barbara Creed writes a chapter in this, another kind of feminist psychoanalytic theorist who coined the term the monstrous feminine. And so, and other really influential authors. But I would say that I would consider monster studies and monster theory to be a postmodern, kind of critical analysis of But obviously, when Tolkien wrote his piece on Beowulf, that that kind of falls into this gray area. But Tolkien wasn't writing, a monster theory or a monster studies piece. I kind of situate the beginning of monster studies as occurring in 1996, when Jeffrey Jerome Cohen wrote this seminal essay, Monster Culture. And that's in his book, the 1996 book, I believe, Monster Theory Reading Culture.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I think, this is when he kind of lists the 7 theses of monster studies. So I think, this is kind of when I would say this is when this field or this subfield began. But Tolkien's essay, in 1936 essay, is a huge inspiration, or had a huge impact on what is now monster studies, because it was kind of one of the first academic essays or critical essays that argued for the importance of monsters in the overall construction of how, let's say in this instance, in the instance of Beowulf, how a heroic narrative is constructed, perpetuated, maintained, and how one is actually successful. You need monsters for that. They're necessary for that. And also kind of Tolkien, he wasn't necessarily taking Grendel's side or even necessarily propping Grendel up, but he did kind of situate Grendel a bit actually in the spotlight in his article, which wasn't really occurring within, these kind of academic writings prior to kind of, centering, I should say, like the centering of the monster and kind of discussing or analyzing what the function of the monster was, in this instance, Beowulf. And then now, I mean, that is such a central part of monster studies now, is centering on the monster, focusing on the monster. We're not just looking at the monster from the perspective of the haunted. We're looking at the monster from the perspective of the monster as well, and holding those two things simultaneously in tandem. Then you can kind of ask, well, who is the monster haunting? Why is the monster haunting this person or this population? What is the monster mad at? What is the monster angry at? And then simultaneously, which populations are actually afraid of that monster? How is that monster used by people within discourse and narrative making and myth making and folklore? And then how does that usage and that kind of deployment of fear, how does that benefit which group or which population? And how does it maybe even further subjugate other groups and other populations? And what I mean by that is, of course, there are the monster kind of doesn't just, let's say, float above or haunt, bedevil around this kind of sphere of our cultural imagination. Somewhere in like the liminal ether, the monster is very concrete and very real, maybe not in a material way, but the monster is real because the effects of the monster are real. And certain oppressed or stigmatized or marginalized groups themselves become monsterized. And that's kind of a part of monster theory and monster studies that I feel is so valuable. Like, not only looking at how the monster, the mythic monster, is used, not only looking at, from the mythic monster's perspective, their kind of origin story or their motivations or their like feelings, but also kind of examining which groups get aligned with certain monsters or which groups kind of become monstrous themselves. Or if you look at a monster like the vampire, what kind of marginalized populations or deviant populations does the vampire end up being associated with? And then how does that kind of further perpetuate these kind of subconscious taboos and prejudices within our grand collective imagination? If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And I am now, thinking about how this must be a modern construct, because in the past, the way monsters have been approached has been very one-sided, no dimension, no depth. It's just that's the bad, scary monster. It's there to kill you or to harm or damage or whatever, fill in the blank, is some type of negative outcome. And it was, I mean, you mentioned the vampire. If we think about Anne Rice and the way she wrote about vampires, completely changed the perspective on the vampire, because then you had vampires such as Louis, who was struggling with the fact that he didn't want to kill people. Then you had Lestat at a later date thinking, well, I'm just going to kill the evil doer. So you have a monster that is like ridding society of all of the serial killers and the rapists and all of those types of figures.
Yes.
So you have this, totally different perspective on the character of what we would have thought of as the monster, as in like a classic Dracula tale. The shift that occurred within at least the vampire narrative. Now vampires are very feeling creatures, empathetic creatures, also very attractive. Nowadays, who doesn't want to be a vampire? They're sexy.
That's true. Yeah, they are. Right. Yeah, they are. And that's kind of one of the things, I think, one of Cohen's theses, the first actually, is a monster's body is a cultural body.
Yeah.
And so then you can actually kind of see this transition of, if we just take the vampire. I was discussing this with the class in the HHP summer school, Arcane Worlds. I gave a lecture on the monster. And after I kind of looked at, like the vampire in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then Nosferatu and Carmilla, which actually came before Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then kind of, looking at Gary Oldman's Dracula within Bram Stoker's Dracula, the film by Francis Coppola, and kind of being like, what cultural backdrop was that against, which I would love to get into in a second. But I always have to bring up Twilight when I talk about vampires because it's so phenomenal to me. Exactly kind of going with what you were saying of the vampire used to be so fearsome. Villages would dig up bodies to drive stakes through the hearts of corpses out of fear. Yes. That, it went from something so fearful to then something very sexual and representing this kind of hunger to then becoming very queer coded. That is, its own topic altogether. But then with Twilight, all of a sudden you have the vampire who is kind of takes this position, specifically Edward Cullen, I would say, takes the position of the moral character, the character who has the moral high ground, the vampiric virgin who, because he's from, the 1700s, 1800s originally, he always had wanted to wait till marriage before, having sexual intercourse. And it's Bella, the 18-year-old human of the 21st century, who's this kind of temptress, tempting this very pure and chivalrous vampire. And then actually the werewolves are more representative of this kind of lesser monster, more violent, less rational, less moral. But all of a sudden, the vampire becomes virginal and, kind of the moral compass of one narrative, the narrative being Twilight. And it just goes to show that whatever cultural backdrop the monster exists in, it can haunt very differently, of course, but it always swings back around. This now doesn't mean that Stephenie Meyer has ruined the sexy edge of vampires, forever with her kind of more virginal vampiric being. But it is just interesting to, just see how monsters can be utilized within different spheres in that way.
Definitely,
I think,
because Anne Rice was very queer-coded in her vampire stories. Twilight has made the vampire into like a god type being, because now the vampire it can be in the sunlight and sparkles in the sunlight like a god. So the as I was saying, the vampire in Twilight seems to be this godlike creature, very humanized as well, because they live in like a family unit.
And with partners.
Exactly. And of course, this is all coming from a very Mormon coded background. However, what I found also, you mentioned the werewolves, I found it to be kind of problematic because the werewolves were, of course, this indigenous American family, and I believe they were all related to each other, weren't they? They weren't just other like friends. I think
they were actually related.
Yeah, I think they were all family members. So that meaning, so that there was like this contest between who was the more powerful. Was it when she brought that when Stephenie Meyer put the werewolves as these indigenous people, I was like, no, why did you have to do that? That makes everything so messy. Anyway.
Exactly. And that's also a great point. And we can super briefly circle back to Grendel and Beowulf. We're considering maybe Grendel's perspective and who is he angry at and why is he angry? Grendel was kind of the indigenous population, albeit a creature of the property of that the kingdom took over, essentially. Mm-hmm. So that you could see Grendel as kind of a monsterized indigenous character. And then I think that we can actually still see that being perpetuated even within such a recent cultural fixture such as Twilight. Of course, you have the vampires as monsters. You have the werewolves as monsters, but one of these monsters is very glamorous and, again, moral. Yeah. Carlisle is a doctor saving humans' lives. Mm-hmm. Edward is an enduring virgin. And then you have the werewolves who are kind of represented as more of the problematic monster, the scary monster, the monster that is just getting in the way of Bella and Edward's happiness. It's some kind of negative kind of portrayal or connotation. And as you rightly point out, that their monstrosity is tied to their indigenous identity, because being like the werewolf kind of, could you say it? Oh, the werewolf gene was something that was passed down through this bloodline of this indigenous population. So it's the monstrosity is tied there.
Wasn't it a curse or no? Am I misremembering? I don't even know. I don't know.
No, I can't remember if it was a curse.
Not going to make any hard statements there, but
can't remember how she framed it. Yeah,
I can't remember how it was framed, but I just found that to be problematic.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Even though there were a lot of what was the werewolf boy's name that loved?
Jacob.
Jacob, yeah, you had Team Jacob and Team all that stuff.
Team Edward,
that was just all kind of a crazy time period. Even though there were a lot of attractive aspects to the werewolves as well, I just found situating these werewolves in an indigenous people, I just thought, why did you have to do that, girl? That was anyway. But on the other hand,
agreed. Yep.
On the other hand, coming from a Mormon background, of course, their upbringing probably has very different. I mean, I'm not Mormon. I can't speak to that, and I don't want to offend any Mormons. I'm not trying to say that they're all racist or that they have backwards thinking about things. Of course not. However, there is this narrative within the Christian American history that Native Americans should not speak their language anymore, that they should convert to Christianity. I mean, this is history. So I feel like I can mention this because it is a historical fact that a lot of indigenous cultures have lost their cultures to a great extent because of Christianity.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's why I find this all to be very problematic. Anyway, what does it offer the monster theory, monster studies? What does it offer the you as a scholar? What or scholars in general?
Well, one of the things that, again, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen says, and this essay, it was a post forward just a random post forward he wrote for another kind of monster theory edited volume or collection, but when he's discussing the pedagogy of monsters, and a few monster theorists have also discussed this, but I particularly kind of like the way Cohen discusses it, because for me it really invokes these ties to esotericism studies. But he asks, what do monsters teach us? What can they teach us? But then also this component of what knowledge or secrets or truths could they let us in on? And what kind of unknowns could they actually illuminate? I think this essay of his is called, I believe it's called The Promise of Monsters. And this is an angle that I really like and I think is really fruitful, at least in terms of how I use monster studies and monster theory. Because there is this kind of, this promise of monsters letting us in on something. I discussed this a bit in my Lilith course. We kind of touched upon this my last session when I was talking about Lilith in antiquity. And then we kind of, somehow we were also talking about Lilith within, let's say, 20th century feminism. There is kind of this idea, at least within cultural studies, like you could kind of take the monster, and monster studies certainly also has this as well. If we take the monster and we kind of examine its function and why people are afraid of it, eventually we whittle down to the conclusion, or a conclusion, that the monster is kind of this, border patrol agent for hegemonic branches of society, kind of having the fear of the monster being, swimming throughout the cultural imagination, just gives everyone that, inner visceral feeling of, if you don't want to get, snatched by the monster under your bed, sleep with your feet tucked into the blanket and not dangling over the edge. It's the same with monsters, but bigger. If you want to remain within society and the safety and the confines of society, don't try to go outside of these rules of law and order and gender and sexuality and presentation, what have you, that we, the hegemonic mainstream, have established. Because look at all of these monsters out here represent all these kind of deviancies And if you start aligning with these deviancies, then you'll just get further and further onto the margins, and the monster will get you. But monster studies can also present it as, okay, but what if you do get to the edge of the bed or the edge of the social order? What is actually on the other side? And then this is kind of where, queer theory also comes into this. Elizabeth Freeman's book Time Binds, which actually kind of talks about queer hauntology and chrononormativity, which, is, her kind of framing of the heterosexual normalization of the concept of time. It's very heady, but regardless, it kind of feeds into that of we could actually envision utopias if we, instead of being afraid that the monster was going to snatch us, if we instead shifted, well, what can the monster teach us? What does the monster want to show us? Monsters have something to say. Monster theorists try to listen. If you go to the edge, it might not be that you get snatched. It might be that you become illuminated with some secret knowledge that the monster has, or some utopian potential, or some horizon of liberation. I think that's another way Jerome Cohen put it, horizons of liberation, that these kind of monsters represent. And in that way, I think that it's super fruitful for a lot of kind of postmodern theories, a lot of, analytical research endeavors for academia more generally. But I think I'm also super biased. I think there's a lot of more general ways that monster studies can benefit us. We should look at monsters have been around since antiquity. We should look at them. But for me, I'm kind of like, no, we should listen to them. Right. What do they know?
What was the name of the author that you just mentioned?
Besides Cohen, was it Elizabeth Freeman
that
I mentioned? Yeah.
Okay. And what was the name of the book?
The book is Time Binds. She does not necessarily, she doesn't. She doesn't talk about monster theory, or I don't even think necessarily monsters at all in that book, but she does, kind of just talk about chrononormativity, which is how chronology is structured in a normative heterosexual hegemonic society, and that it basically of birth, childhood, integration, education, career, procreation, or marriage, procreation, death, and that queer sexualities disrupt that singular timeline.
Right. Okay.
And within this singular timeline, from beginning to end, this linear timeline, there's also only ever the human kind of past, which isn't really considered the present, and then you're working towards some future that's already been preordained for you on this timeline, and that's it. Whereas queer temporalities kind of actually also hearken always to the past. It's kind of a past that haunts the present and is carried forth. And then the present isn't conforming to the kind of normative timeline, which then creates a multitude of potential futures instead of a linear future.
Okay. Yeah.
And I could vaguely relate that to monster theory, because monsters also muddy something that is preordained for humans in a different way.
I understand what you mean.
The fear of the monster is preordained for us, but what if instead of fearing the monster, there's a collaboration or a learning from?
Conversation.
Yeah.
Right. So you mentioned earlier about this, that monsters might have some type of secret knowledge, of course, and that brings us to esotericism and what monster studies might have to do with that. I was reading today some work about Lilith in regards to left-hand path magical practices, and certain groups like the Dragon Rouge. And I believe Kenneth Grant as well, their ideas of left-hand path has to do more about attaining power. And that Lilith has been associated with Tantra, and that Tantra in the West has been misunderstood as being more sexual, whereas in these particular groups,
Yeah.
This is more about attainment of power. And I was wondering if, thinking about our discussion that we were going to have today, if there is anything to be said about that as well with monsters, because a lot of monsters are very strong, powerful creatures that, present a, formidable battle with, if you're talking about good and evil and that type of thing. And it has to do with this power struggle that ensues then with whenever the monster arrives. You have to try to, it's like the cave troll in the Lord of the Rings. You got to get rid of that cave troll because, it's this huge, powerful creature that, you have to vanquish. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, about how this would apply to the monster studies and monster theory.
Yeah. Well, one kind of sub-point you bring up that this is where, kind of monster studies and monster theory can sometimes get a bit complicated for me, because there are monsters that besides Lilith, that I would certainly either identify with or have sympathy for or even like root for, right? And then there are certain monsters that I'm actually terrified of. If this particular monster is in a horror movie, I actually can't watch that horror movie. Or, if I'm watching Lord of the Rings and there's that squid-like kraken creature that tries to eat Frodo, and then there's the cave troll, and then there's that huge orc that almost kills Aragorn, I'm not rooting for, and like, okay, orcs also, I'm not rooting for them.
We're not rooting for the Uruk-hai. I'm sorry.
No. So then that's when I'll have to be like, okay, well, in terms of monster theory, the Uruk-hai could teach us things. We could say, well, why did Tolkien write them and present them in this certain way? And like, why was it so extra scary that not only would they eat, man flesh and hobbits, but sometimes they'd also turn on each other and eat each other? Like, what's the fear there? Yeah. What's the scariness there? Oh, okay. It's like a lack of loyalty and a lack of boundary to where your violence will go. Usually kind of in our, let's say, a more civilized human society, right? You have these boundaries of, like, let's say two countries are at war, which direction the violence is going. Whereas, the orcs, not only are they in a war with men, but they'll also kind of turn that violence on each other, and it gets unpredictable and chaotic. And like, that's the fear. And so in that case, when I'm not on the orc side, I can just kind of, we can brainstorm even in a fun way of like, okay, well, why are the orcs so scary, and what's the function, and what do they add to the overall narrative, and da. But then there are certain monsters such as Lilith that I'm like, oh yes, I'm a fan. I fully stand by your narrative. I fully stand by your perspective. Love this reclamation moment she's having. All of that. So when you're, also when you're kind of talking about, like, let's say Dragon Rouge and Lilith in terms of Dragon Rouge. Dragon Rouge is interesting in terms of the entire left-hand path milieu, because I think that Dragon Rouge really centers actually the feminine infernal and the feminine monstrous more than a lot of other kind of left-hand path societies or organizations, where Lilith is the base point of the first initiatory kind of gate that one goes through. And going through the womb of Lilith within the Dragon Rouge discourse. Yeah. But they also employ so many other kind of very powerful yet demonized or monsterized female deities, such as Kali and Hel, perhaps Hecate, etc. So yeah, I think they kind of really wield the monstrous feminine in a very subversive way in terms of just that milieu. But anyway, this kind of concept of like the left-hand path in general using certain infernal deities to gain knowledge, power, etc. And even Dragon Rouge in particular using Lilith for that means. This definitely falls in line with, and this is where monster studies and esotericism can go hand in hand as well, because this falls in line with what do monsters teach us. And also at the same time, we can tell a lot about a group by the monsters they fear and employ, or maybe we can actually tell a lot about a group by the monsters that they align with and use and actually invoke. That's where the esoteric component comes in. So, like, what conclusions could we come to about Dragon Rouge, considering their specific use of Lilith, their positioning of Lilith as like the base initiation? They're centering a lot of rituals around Lilith. What does that say about that society? So then that, I feel like, would be, you know, if there's further research done on Dragon Rouge, although I think Kenneth Grant, right? Granholm, yeah. Oh, yes, right, of course. The Grant, yeah. Thinking of actual esotericists now, yeah. Kenneth Granholm. I read his book on his time, you know, studying the Dragon Rouge and actually kind of being alongside of them a few years back. And he did a fantastic job. But if there's any more kind of research that comes out about Dragon Rouge, I think monster studies, monster theory would be a great add.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And, you know, in terms of just, an etic kind of consideration of the monstrous. But there is one, I had this, it's written on a Post-it on my computer, actually. It's this one quote from a article on monster theory that I read by Ben Berrutez. I'll send you his name. He just wrote an article using monster theory and monster studies to kind of talk about the feminine, monstrosity, and what that means for potential liberation within 19th century British literature, I think it was. I'll look at up the actual article and send you that.
Okay, thank you.
But the quote that he says in this article that really sticks with me and I think applies here is, freedom is not the cause of monstrosity, it's the effect. And that is kind of what I think you could argue maybe a society like Dragon Rouge maybe trying to achieve with their emic use of Lilith, but also what certain oppressed or marginalized populations may be realizing with their own emic leaning into the monstrous or the monstrous nature that gets projected onto them by society.
This is the end of the free content of this episode. You can listen to the full episode over at my Patreon page. Tier 1 membership allows you to listen to the entire episode first before the free content is uploaded. Membership for Tier 1 is reasonably priced at $2 or euros a month. If for whatever reason this isn't suitable for you, the episode can also be purchased individually. Please check out the Patreon site as there is so much more available there. As always, thanks for listening.